So what happened to the 4 million years of matriarchal, vegan-based societies? How was life during that time? What happened to the records of that time? Again, it was hidden by stories like what we read about in the Garden of Eden and the timeline of evolution. So where history begins, her story ends. And the reason I say her story is prior to the dynastic time, Mother Nature ruled. So again, what we call the beginning of time is not the beginning of natural time, because human origins can be traced back as far as 5 million years ago. So this beginning that we all grew up learning about is only a beginning that takes us back to 7,000 years ago with the rise of Norma. So the beginning of history today, most of us equate with the beginning of time or the beginning of human origins, meaning the beginning of the earth. We don't realize that the biblical Genesis is not the beginning. It's the beginning of a new age. And the book of Revelation is not the end of the world. It's the end of an age. Because what we don't realize when the Bible speak about the beginning of the world and ending of the word world translates to the word age. And this is very important. Want to keep this in mind as we move on. The last age ended 7,000 years ago, and the clocks was set back to day 1 from 3100 BC. So 3100 BC is the beginning of this age. So 7,000 years ago would have been the year Christ was born. Now the book of Genesis is also 7,000 years old. So now we see why Adam is just the first Christ. So 7,000 years ago would have been the birth of Christ. But 7,000 years ago was really the first dynasty and the first year of the rule of Norma. So that would have been the year Christ was born. And we also see why the book of Genesis is 7,000 years old and why Christ is a form of Adam or Atum and Norma or Menes. Day 1, year 1 would have been when the Greeks took control of writing history. And when Manetho started writing about Norma, Manetho was writing long after Norma's death. So from 3100 BC, which was the beginning of the Old Kingdom or First Dynasty, to 1085 BC, which was the end of the New Kingdom. So we went from the Old Kingdom to the Middle Kingdom to the New Kingdom. That'll take us from 3100 BC to 1085 BC. Each of the kingdoms is split up by an intermediate period, which is kind of a transition in time, and we're going to talk about that later. But just to get a grasp of the timeline, from 3100 BC to the third intermediate period, which ended around 525 BC. After that, the Persians ruled to 332 BC. And then when the Greeks started taking control and rewriting history from 332 BC all the way down to year 1, you can see why everything we know about the first so-called Kemetic pharaoh comes from the Greeks. So when Manetho was telling us about Norma, he was telling us years after Norma's dynasty. So everything we know about Norma come from Greek historians. This account is what was being forged when they started so-called writing history, and they started everything from the beginning of the first dynasty, not the beginning of the earth. 3100 BC is said to be the beginning of writing. And as we travel the timeline and approach year 1 where BC meets AD, we can see that at this time the Greeks were in charge of writing history. So we can see during this time was the fashioning of all of the texts that control all of the world's main ideologies, what we know about our origins and all of that. But it predates to the first king or the first pope, not to the first humans, but the first families. You can see that as we approach year 1, where BC meets AD, we're looking at Greek rule, Roman rule, Islamic rule,
merged with Egyptian rule. And if you look at today's world, you can see the main influence of those entities being Islam, and Roman and Greek would be Christianity. So those are your two main world religions, Christianity and Islam. And you can see those main two on our timeline here as the main two entities that brought us into year one. So here we are in 2018, and these are the main two entities still ruling, still going to war, Christianity and Islam.
And if you count up from day one, year one, to 2018, you can see how we get to this current year and how the timeline was split. And also, we know that the earth is older than 2018 years old. It's just been 2018 years since the split. We're talking about a time span of 5,000 to 7,000 years roughly. And this is how long they said civilization has been standing. And we just went over this word civilization and the context they're using it in to imply of primitive people who weren't tamed by male government, so to speak. So that was a transitioning phase, and this is how the timeline was split from BC to AD, because the first dynasties and the new age or the new world began 3100 BC. They was counting time down during this time. So when they reached day one, year one, they started counting back up again. And by then, the Romans and the Greeks had unified with Egypt. And this is how everybody is under this Gregorian calendar today. So what was going on prior to 3100 BC that led up to 3100 BC and there being a dynastic age that we're in today? How did we leave this great golden era, which we're going to talk about? How did we leave this great golden era, which contains 4 million plus years of our human origins? And it was known by many as a time where we thrived in a sort of heavenly-like state, which is described in the Garden of Eden. How did we leave that and end up into this dynastic time and the beginning of a new calendar and new systems of government? How did we transition from it? To answer this question, we must understand that the first wars were gender wars based upon social differences. And we'll talk about these gender wars more in detail as we move on. Basically, her story is prehistory or pre-dynastic time, or before the time when male rulers ruled the world with governments and royal families or dynasties. It was the time when everyone was sovereign and lived freely with nature's inheritance. No one governed the land and the people. There were no man-made rules, only laws of nature. The creation of the timeline of evolution is a blasphemous joke that hides this 4 to 5 million years of human records of thriving gardening societies that existed on Earth. It hides that huge record behind a silly timeline of monkey-like creatures, ape-like creatures that came here from space. So this is your space monkey concept. You can see that 1 million years ago, it's the time of Homo erectus, or what they called a Flintstone type man. But you got to keep in mind he was half ape-like as well, because he came from Australopithecus. So they want us to believe that the species that originated today's humans was ape-like, and that everything prior to 3100 BC, what we call her story or prehistory, was the time of Flintstone-like, dummy-like humans, as you can see in this timeline in front of you. But what debunks this blasphemy is the fact that if we come from ape-like humans, we would still see ape-like humans walking around today. And this is why they have a huge need to sell you the Bigfoot and Sasquatch stories, to try to say, hey, here's the missing link. Here's the ape-like, human-like creature that we come from. But these things are only a myth, And if this was really true, that would be many, many Bigfoots around. It would be in the zoo. We wouldn't have to search all over. It wouldn't be a conspiracy. So the masses have been conspired upon by deceivers, and I'm just revealing that deception right now. If you look at this timeline of evolution, it's blasphemous, and it hides 4 million years of prehistory that they don't want you to know about, to show you the truth, who you really are and who you really come from, and what life was like when the earth was in its natural state, and the spirituality and mentality of the human was in its natural state. This was pre-dynastic time. Now, the beginning of the dynasties represent the beginning of the governments which govern the mental. So we left our true mental state. Now we're under a false mental state. The pre-dynastic humans didn't have the same social structure we have, and that's important to know as we get deep into this, to show you how we transition through the timelines and the great calendrical deception. So when you think about what I'm telling you here, that during the golden ages of humanity, it represents millions of years as opposed to the 7,000 years of New World Order, dumbed down state that we've been in. That show you that this rule of governments and dynasties over the masses and the animals is very short. It's like a day compared to the millions of years of us living in our natural state. But I do want to show you how the transitioning took place. And in order to do that, I had to go through this overview. So thank y'all for being patient.